What's up everybody, my name's Luke. It took me a tremendously long time to get this camera, over a year of being on the waiting list, but I finally have it in my hands. I've finally been able to field test it for a 4-week safari in East Africa between Kenya and Tanzania. It's my first foray into mirrorless coming from the Nikon D850s. So yeah, today what I wanted to do was put together a quick video for you on how I set this camera up. Basically how I set it up, not too in depth. So if you want to learn some more about it and how I shoot it, please stick around. Righto guys, so as you can see I've got this camera tethered to the Ninja Atmos here so that you can see exactly what it is that I'm doing on the camera. As I say, this is just going to be a basic setup of the camera, nothing too in-depth. We're not going to get into the focusing system in this one because it is very in-depth and very complicated, so we'll make a whole standalone video for that. There'll also be videos coming from me on overviews and reviews, how this camera operates, how it did against the Sony A1 on my recent safari, and yeah, anyway, so let's get into it. I'm going to swap to the camera screen now so that you can see all the different menus. And really what we're going to be dealing with today is just between the shooting menu or the photo shooting menu and the video recording menu. There are a number of other icons going down the left hand side here, and for those of you that are old Nikon legacy shooters, you'll know what all of these icons do. I've always found Nikon menus, and I'm not being biased, just to be the best. They are the easiest to understand, and they just make sense, not too trying to be too clever for themselves, if you know what I mean. Looking at you, Sony, and Canon, really. Anyway, so let's jump into it. We've got our photo shooting bank or menu. Obviously, this is everything to do with photography, and video recording is obviously everything to do with filming. Anyway, so essentially what you can see here is when we open up that menu, we have shooting menu bank. Mine is set to A. You can have various menu banks set up that will control certain things like this. When you go back to your home or back to your shooting screen, if you push information, this is your shooting bank over here. So you can have multiple ones of this just depending on what it is that you're looking for. And that sets up through the menus now. So yeah, you can come and select it here, A, B, C, D. And then edit those as you need. Of course, extended menu banks are on, rather work with more information than less. Storage folder name, you know, between this and file naming, this can help people dramatically, particularly if you're using two Nikon Z9s. What I like to do within file naming here is change this to not DSC, which is just standard Nikon naming, but I prefer to change this to something like Nikon or Z9. If you have two of them, Z9A, Z9B, Z91, Z92, and that will help you at least understand which camera the image came from when it comes to your catalog in Lightroom and so forth. You can also name it to do with your lenses, so Nikon or Z9 300, Z9 70 200, you know, something like that, just to help you make sense of it all. Right, then we have role played by a card in slot 2. So with the Nikon Z9, just like most of the pro bodies and a lot of cameras these days, there's 2 card slots. And if you have a look just here on the side, you'll see that there's the 2 card slots there. At the moment, I have one CFast or CF Express card installed. The CFast cards are the big old chunky things that used to suck. They're terrible. But yeah, so this camera can take 2 of these. It can also fit the XQDs. So yeah, feel free to use your old XQDs. I've been doing that. And they work flawlessly. Obviously, XQD is a little bit slower than CF Express, but it does the job really well. Anyway, jumping back onto the menus. So you can decide what you would like that second card slot to do. Overflow, basically when one card fills up, the next card starts filling up. Backup, pretty self-explanatory. Every photograph that you take is backed up to both cards or copied onto both cards. This is really good for wedding photographers, event photographers, people that just cannot afford to lose those images. I know a lot of wildlife photographers like to shoot like this as well. Then you can set it to RAW slot 1 and JPEG slot 2 if you like, so that you can essentially, you know, the best use case for this would be someone that likes to have their photographs in RAW to edit later, but also wants to produce images that are quickly available to share. So on card 1 you would have your RAWs, card 2 you would have your JPEGs. And then the last option is JPEG 1, JPEG 2. And then you can set that the size of those JPEGs if you would like. You know, I don't shoot JPEG at all, but if you're wanting to shoot JPEG and back up those JPEGs, then this is what you're looking for. Anyway, moving on, we've got image area. This is where you will essentially decide between full frame or FX or crop frame or DX. you know, you're using a Nikon Z9, it should be in full frame or FX for the most part. You can change to DX if you want. It will give you a crop factor of 1.6 times or 1.4 times with Nikon, sorry, which gives you a little bit more zoom. But it also will remove some of the megapixels from your overall image. So I think when you are shooting in DX, it goes down to like a 22 megapixel sensor or readout, whereas when you're shooting in FX, it's the full 46 odd megapixels with the Z9. Now you have some other options, 1:1, which will be appealing to the Instagram people out there that like shooting squares. And then you get 16:9 if you're wanting to produce those quite cinematic shots. Quite nice for fine art peeps. But yeah, for the most part, I set this up, FX. Then after that, we have image quality. This is where you will decide if you would like to photograph RAW or JPEG or RAW and JPEG. You know, if you're shooting with something like a Nikon Z9, particularly for wildlife photography, and you're trying to take really good photographs with a really amazing end result, just set it in RAW and don't mess around with that too much more. Of course, a lot of people like to have those JPEGs, so feel free to set it that way if you like. But generally speaking, think about your storage limitations and so forth. Rather just shoot the RAWs, get the maximum readout files, and edit them later in Lightroom and really get the most out of them. Right, we then have RAW recording. So Nikon managed to achieve something pretty cool with the Z9, and that's called lossless compression. Doesn't make much sense in the photography world. Generally, you will have loss if you have compression. But upon sort of testing different photographs taken with the Z9, or the same photograph taken with the Z9 as the D850. Remember, the D850 has uncompressed RAW folders, and the D850 produces images on uncompressed RAW at about 90 to 100 megabytes per file, whereas the Z9 on lossless compression produces about 40 to 50 megabytes per file. So half the size, and really when I was inspecting these photographs, there really isn't any difference between the two cameras. They both use essentially the same type of sensor, or the same megapixel sensor, and so yeah, not much of a loss there. So please don't panic. Really, it's been quite cool for me, and I have saved half my storage. You know, it doesn't really add up. It doesn't really work that way because the Z9 takes a lot more frames per second than the D850. But yeah, there are the two options, but really use the best option, which is lossless compression, and get the best file size that you can out of this camera. What's the point in getting a beautiful Z9 when you're going to, you know, limit its file quality? Next up, ISO sensitivity settings. I do not shoot auto ISO, so I leave that off. Of course, if you want to shoot auto ISO, go for it, but I would, you know, advise you shoot manual ISO. But that's a debate for another time. White balance, I set to Kelvin, and usually 5800. You know, it depends on the shoot, but 5800 for Africa, it's a warm place. And I do sometimes change this out in the field. Actually, I do often, particularly for sunsets and sunrises. I'll drop this maybe down to 4800, 3800. Just feel it out until you get the best results. But generally speaking, 5800 on the Z9 and you're done. It looks beautiful every single time. Now, for those of you that are living in a cooler environment, the Northern Hemisphere, the Arctic Circle, something like that, rather start trialing this from about 3800 going up from there. You don't really want orange snow, so watch out for that. But that's how I utilize white balance, and that's also a whole nother story for another day. But yeah, Kelvin 5800. Picture quality, or set picture control, sorry. I always shoot in standard. You know, you do have the option to shoot in monochrome natively if you like, which has been quite appealing for a lot of people that like to shoot black and white. You don't have to do that later in Lightroom. And you also are setting your camera specifically for your monochrome photography, which is pretty cool. But yeah, standard. Rather don't leave it in auto, rather take control, just put it in standard coloration. And essentially what you'll have is a more usable RAW later on that you can edit the colors back from. Yeah, that's where I leave it. Manage picture control, nothing interesting there. Color space, I always shoot in Adobe RGB. Essentially, sRGB is really good for the online world, like websites, Instagram, Facebook. Adobe RGB is really good for the print world. So I set it to Adobe RGB. And if I need to export a photograph from Lightroom in sRGB for online use, then I just change it in the export dialog there. Active delighting, I keep that off. This is a feature that Nikon has been working on over the years to improve their dynamic range. You know, the detail that you're able to pull from shadows and brights in the same frame. I leave this off. I don't generally find it does things too well. You might find it works better for those of you that shoot indoors a lot, but you know, I haven't really found too much of a use for it. I have tried it. It has a number of settings you can go through. I've gone through all of them and tried different things, but generally speaking, best results come from off. And you'll find that with a lot of these weird features that camera manufacturers add. Long exposure noise reduction, I leave that off. High ISO noise reduction, I leave that off. You really don't want your camera deciding how much noise reduction to impart into an image just because of your high ISO. Rather do that yourself. Vignette control, I leave this on low. I am a sucker for a bit of vignette, but I don't want to let the camera have, put that off and let the camera decide or apply a lot of vignette to it. I prefer to add that back in Lightroom. So I leave it on low. I find that to be the best results in order just to darken up those corners of the image just a little bit without it becoming sort of obnoxious and pretty cheesy looking. Diffraction compensation, I leave that off. Auto distortion control, I leave that off. Flicker reduction, I leave that off. High frequency flicker reduction, I leave that off. These are two things that will help you deal with flickering lights inside. When you're shooting under halogen lights, or some forms of lights will often produce a flickering, and this will help you deal with that. Metering, I leave this in spot metering. A lot of people like to shoot matrix metering. That's fine. If it works for you, go for it. I prefer spot metering. I prefer to expose for the exact spot where my focal point is in every image, as opposed to trying to expose for the whole scene. Think about it. Rather expose for the leopard's face under the tree than the tree, the sky, and the leopard under the tree, and end up with a weird kind of HDR feel. Yeah. Then focus mode, AFC, of course this changes all the time, as you'll know in wildlife photography, but generally speaking it's an AFC, or autofocus continuous. Wherever you point the camera, as long as you're holding AF on, it will continue to refocus on that point. So yeah, single focus will focus once, and then you need to recompress the button or re-depress the button to get it to focus again on your new spot. Manual focus, pretty self-explanatory. Area AF mode, as I said guys, we'll do a deep dive into the focusing system of this camera at some point in time, but yeah, this changes all the time as well. AF detection, obviously I'm a wildlife photographer, so I leave this in animal. If you're a people photographer, go for it. If you're a vehicle photographer, put that on. It works really well. The animal IAF and face AF is working pretty swanky in this camera. I'm quite impressed with it so far. Then have multiple exposure off, HDR overlay off, interval timer shooting off. Obviously these can come on should I want to do bracketing, should I want to do multiple exposures. HDR I don't mess with at all. I have no use for HDR. And then interval shooting, obviously if you want to do time lapsing and things like that. Pretty cool for nightscape, star photography, and so forth. So yeah, if you are into this sort of photography, you'll know how to use this. I don't use it all the time, neither will you, so it's generally off until I need it. Right, so that's the photo shooting menu and a quick rundown of that. Then onto the video recording menu. Once again, you can set your banks, and then after that, extended menus on, of course. The same sort of naming idea here if you want. If you're shooting 2 Z9s, change this to Z9-1, Z9-2, or however you would like to name that up. Destination, sorry, I've gone to the shooting menu. Destination, you wanted to shoot to slot 1, you can make it shoot to slot 2 if there's a card in there. So essentially what you can do is set this up so that video records to slot 2 and stills record to slot 1. Pretty cool feature. I don't set it up that way, but you can. Video file type, there's a lot going on here with the Nikon Z9. It is a phenomenal filming device, especially for the pros. I like to just get film straight out of camera and not really play with ProRes or NRAW, 12-bit, all these different really high quality filming features that require you to color grade your footage later on. So really what I shoot on is H.265 8-bit MOV, and I mean you can change this to 10-bit if you like, but generally speaking I shoot on 8-bit, and that's what I'd recommend for you unless you are a serious videographer. Yeah, frame size, obviously with the Z9 there's a lot going on. It shoots in 8K up to 30 frames. Generally speaking I'll be shooting in 4K at 60 frames or 4K at 30 frames depending on the ambient light. One of the cool features of this camera is it does shoot in 4K slow-mo, or 120 frames per second. It also shoots 1080 slow-mo. I would have loved it if they had the 1080 240 frames per second or even more on this camera, but I'm very chuffed to have 4K slow motion. So yeah, you can shoot all the way up to 8K. One day the world's going to be there, probably pretty soon, but it is a huge file type. So yeah, for the most part I'm swapping between 4K resolutions and frame rates. Right, video quality, high, of course. Why would you put it on normal? You know, I know it's just for in RAW, but if you find yourself there, it needs to be on high quality. Image area, same thing as with photography. FX mode or DX mode. FX is obviously the full frame readout. DX mode is the crop frame readout, and it's also going to zoom you in a little bit more. So if you need to get closer, feel free to use this. It will crop into the image, but that crop produces more zoom. So yeah, if the line's a little bit far away, just quickly swap to DX mode and start filming that way. Right, extended oversampling, I leave that off. ISO sensitivity, I do sometimes shoot auto ISO in film. It helps just smooth out things, so this will change on and off just depending. If it's really good light, I manual ISO it. If it's tricky light, clouds are moving in, sun's coming out, whatever it might be, then I'll shoot an auto ISO just so you have a bit of smoothing going on and you don't have this dramatic change from bright to dark. White balance, once again, I shoot the same as photo settings, so in Kelvin and at 5800K for the most part, and that will change depending on what I'm trying to shoot. Remember, the lower that number gets, the cooler the image is going to come out. The higher that number gets, the warmer that image is going to come out. Picture control, I set this to vivid for videography or filming because I just want the footage to come out of camera looking really nice, really vivid. I'm not really too interested in color grading. I just want to capture cool moments, and I'm not trying to make amazing you know, films and videos and so forth. I'm really just trying to capture nature. Picture control, nothing there, sorry. Active delighting off again. High ISO, noise reduction, I leave that on normal for filming because essentially you are sometimes swapping into auto ISO, and so you just want to be able to film that out. There's nothing worse than having really, really grainy footage, so watch out for that. Vignette control, I leave that on low as well. Diffraction compensation off, auto distortion control off, video flicker reduction on auto. That will then pick up if there is flickering lights in your domain, and it will help you deal with that. Metering, on this I use matrix metering. I find it to be a little bit better than using a highlight weighted metering or center weighted metering for videography, so matrix metering. Focus mode, you get AFF for film, as you can see, that's the difference. That's basically just full-time autofocus. It's pretty cool. Basically, as you point the camera around, it will refocus. You don't have to push a button in or anything, it will continue to focus. You then get AFC, which is continuous focus. You push AF on, and it will continue to focus. AFS, pretty self-explanatory as well. Once again, we've got the area mode and the subject detection, obviously animals, because I'm a wildlife photographer and videographer, and this changes a lot all the time. But essentially what wide area AF large means, you get a large box. Any movement that occurs within that box, you can move the box around the screen, but any movement that occurs within that box is what the camera is going to focus on and look for a face or an eye within. So yeah. Vibration reduction, this can go on depending on if you have a lens attached. I don't at the moment, so obviously it's off. And then electronic vibration reduction is on. It really does work quite well in stabilizing your footage. Microphone sensitivity, generally speaking, I'm not shooting with microphones out in the bush. We're not even too worried about capturing sound because there's often a vehicle starting, people chatting, someone chowing their chips behind you, whatever it might be. So when you do see our footage coming out of the field, it's generally to music or to ambient sound or something like that. Frequency response on wide. Obviously, I'm trying to capture, if I am trying to capture sound, it must be the whole ambient sound that's going on, not just the vocals of someone talking. Wind noise reduction, I usually have this on, sorry. It does help quite a bit. It's always been the same with Nikon. Just helps deal with that sound, but nothing works really too well. Headphone volume, for those of you that are shooting, listening to things, your headphones plugged into the side, you can manipulate it here. And yeah, so that's that. That's the basic setup of my Nikon Z9, and as I say, there's so much more to this camera. There is the custom settings menu where you jump into focusing, metering, shooting. I'm busy reading off the back of the screen here at the moment. This is what it looks like, where you can change the real internals of this camera and how it's doing what it does. And we'll do another video on that at some point, but this was just a basic setup on this camera. You also have your playback menu and your setup menu. These are all pretty self-explanatory. Really, with the Z9 and Nikon in general, these three top menus are where the things, where you really set up this camera nicely and quite bespokely for yourself. Anyway, guys, I hope you really enjoyed this video. There's going to be a few more videos coming out on the Z9. I've got a few things planned, but please feel free to ask any questions you might have, and I'll try and include them in the next video. Anyway, until the next one, see ya.